Hey, well, welcome back, everybody. We're going to be finishing up the series. This week's our discussion of the series, the Why Me series, where we're looking at the life of Joseph. And today I want to talk to you about the opportunity we have to respond to adversity in our lives. Joseph faced some serious adversity. He was thrown into a pit and eventually sold into slavery by his brothers. He was falsely accused of sleeping with Potiphar's wife, the guy that he worked for, and eventually he was thrown into prison for that and was forgotten in prison until eventually he was actually brought before the presence of Pharaoh, where he interpreted a dream for Pharaoh. And because he interpreted the dream correctly, he was actually made into the prime minister. He was second in command of all of Egypt. And so he interprets this dream about how Egypt is going to experience 7 years of plenty, and then they're going to experience 7 years of famine. And so Joseph is put in charge of making the preparations to prepare the country for the years of famine. Eventually, the famine hits. Joseph is able to provide the food that's needed. And then interesting thing is his brothers show up to ask for provisions, to ask for food, because the famine is so bad that they're basically starving in the land of Canaan. And so Joseph provides for them. Eventually he moves his family to Egypt and provides some of the best land in all of Egypt for them. And then as the story continues, Jacob, Joseph's father, eventually dies. And we're going to pick it up at the point where after Jacob dies, the brothers are just really nervous and fearful that Joseph is going to take revenge on them for what they had done to him years before. And so they go and they meet with Joseph, and that's where we pick it up in this story. In Genesis chapter 50, verses 18 to 21, it says, "His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. 'We are your slaves,' they said. But Joseph said to them, 'Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children.' And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them." And so how can he do this? How can he respond in this way to his brothers? How can he respond like this rather than reacting impulsively? And to do this time and time again as he's faced adversity in life. He had the capacity to respond to life's challenges rather than simply reacting to them. And it enabled him to improve his circumstances and make the world a better place. So how did Joseph do this? Well, one of the things we see here is that Joseph remembered his place. He remembered his place. He said, am I in the place of God? He realized that he wasn't God. He wasn't God, and he wasn't the one that was going to take revenge. Romans 12:19 says, God says, "It's me who takes revenge." And so in our relationships, right, in our lives, are we trying to take revenge for the adversity that we face? Are we reacting impulsively? Or when we get into situations, when we face adversity, do we respond with kindness, with love and compassion? Maybe it's conflicts we have in our relationships. Do we seek to get back at people? Maybe it's somebody speaks bad about us. Do we then try to speak bad about them? Or are we gracious and kind in how we speak about them? So Joseph remembered his place. The second thing we see here is that Joseph remembered his theology. He says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." The horrible things his brother did to him, they intended to harm Joseph, but God intended it for good. The reason that Joseph was able to get through this adversity and respond the way he did to his brothers is because he knew that God was with him. Time and time again, through Genesis, the account of Joseph, it says that God was with him. He was able to understand at a deep level that God was with him, God was present with him, and that God was using the bad things for good. We might not understand the reasons, but God is using the adversity in our lives for good. Lastly, we talked about how Joseph remembered his purpose. What's the good that's being talked about here? Well, the good is, Joseph says that he will provide for you and your children. And so Joseph provided not just for the Egyptians, he provided for his brothers who treated him terribly years before. He provided for his entire family, and he also provided for the future of the nation of Israel. Because he moved his family, which probably was about 70 people, to Egypt, after 400 years, that family went to 2 to 3 million people that made up the nation of Israel, and fulfilling God's promise that he would raise up a nation to call his own. So God can use our suffering to help others, and that's what God did through the life of Joseph, through Joseph. Ultimately, Jesus is the perfect Joseph. Jesus was the one that went to the cross. Jesus suffered like Joseph suffered at the hands of his brothers. Jesus was betrayed for silver coins like Joseph was betrayed by his brothers for silver coins. But you know what? Through the suffering, Jesus went to the cross, and he provided not just salvation to his family, to a country, but he provided salvation to the world. Listen, suffering has a purpose in your life, and suffering's purpose is for you to use that suffering and care for others. How can you care for others in your life who've gone through suffering? How can you use the suffering for the benefit of others? How can you use your suffering to make others' lives better? So Joseph's story serves as a reminder that responding to challenges with faith and kindness opens the door to the transformation of our character. By responding rather than merely reacting, we not only improve our own circumstances, but potentially make the world a better place. Always remember, how would someone in your circumstances respond if they were confident that God was with them? This fundamental question can lead us to better decisions, inspire those around us, and create potentially a better future. I hope you have a great discussion. God bless.